am completely honest with myself, most days when I say that I am saved by grace through faith, like a good Lutheran, that's really just my backup plan in case being wildly successful doesn't work out. I wish I could say that I'm kidding, but I certainly spend more time thinking about how I could become a standout pickleball champion. And then everyone would love me, and I would make so much money, and then would have so many fewer problems, and it would be totally great. And obviously there are some flaws in this plan, like my complete lack of athleticism, but we'll set that aside. For real though, the constant refrain of be more, be better, that beats through my head is an obvious indication that I think success is more likely to save me than the grace of God. I certainly believe that if I were better at email, or better at keeping a schedule, better at exercise, as well as a more diligent writer, more patient, more kind, more caring, more soft-spoken, more and more and more, then what? I'm not sure, I guess. In a commencement address from 2003, Anne Lamott said that when she was finally a published author making real money, she was like a greyhound catching the mechanical rabbit she'd been chasing all her life. Metal wrapped up in cloth. It wasn't alive. It had no spirit. It was fake. She writes, I got a lot of things that society had promised would make me whole and fulfilled. All the things that the culture tells you from preschool will quiet the throbbing anxiety inside you. Stature, the respect of colleagues, maybe even a kind of low-grade fame. The culture says these things will save you as long as you manage to keep your weight down, but the culture lies. Yet we all strive and yearn for this salvation, no different than the people that James wrote to so long ago. But James wanted more for them and for us. James wanted to challenge the idea that wealth and success were signs of God's favor, but that the true sign of God's blessing was actually a deep need for God. Now, there's this internet story that makes the rounds somewhat regularly, maybe you've seen it too, about a guest preacher who shows up to worship in disguise, dirty and dressed in rags like someone who had been living on the street. The congregation was horrified and treated him with contempt. After all, a big and important person was coming to preach to them. Of course, when the preacher returned later, becollared and clean-shaven, he finds a completely different reception, to the congregation's shame when they realize their error. This is not the story that James is telling, though many interpreters want him to be. He's not reporting some real or hypothetical situation happening in the Jerusalem congregations. The poor were not routinely ignored and the rich celebrated. What James is trying to do in this portion of the letter is to expose the assumptions about the rich and the poor in his culture. The rich folks that James describes with their good robes and their gold rings, these indicate that they were members of the equestrian class, rich men with land, who, along with senators, held high government office throughout the Roman Empire. It was the expectation that these elites would become patrons, supporting with select poor people chosen as their clients, supporting them with money or food or legal help. And while these clients were poor, the reality is that there was even a larger section of society below them that were poorer still and had no patron to support them. The New Testament is really suspicious of this system because it was rife with abuse. In fact, many of the clobber verses against homosexuality in the New Testament aren't really about homosexuality at all, but represent the Bible's strong stance against sexual abuse within patron-client relationships, which were assumed to be all male. The favor and fawning that James is describing is about people outside of this system trying to get into it. The really poor who thought that their salvation would come if they could just make it into the Roman class system. The problem that James is describing isn't just that the poor are getting short shrift in the assembly, but that the assembly is falling back into the same worn-out cultural ruts, that wealth is a sign of divine favor and poverty is a sign of unfaithfulness. Do we not do the same? How often do we assume that the poor are poor as punishment for their moral failure? And how often do we assume that the trappings of wealth, the degrees from fine institutions, the new cars, the Roth IRAs, the vacation homes, are signs of God-given wisdom, of money well invested and spent and therefore earned? Don't mistake me, like James, I'm not interested in a direct attack. What I'm interested in, like James, is faithful living, which is active, thoughtful, self-reflective, holistic, and alive. When I read these passages from James, I hear echoes of Oscar Romero, who preached of God's preferential option for the poor, not just in theory, but in practice, and with his whole life. In one of his Advent sermons, Romero said, "The person who feels the emptiness of hunger for God is the opposite of the self-sufficient person. In this sense, rich means the proud. Rich means even the poor who have no property, but who think they need nothing, not even God. This is the wealth that is abominable in God's eyes, what the humble but forceful virgin speaks of. God sent away empty-handed the rich, those who think they have everything, and filled with good things the hungry, those who have need of God." James writes, "Has God not chosen the poor of the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom promised to those who love God?" It is all too easy for us to get caught up chasing success, so sure that ease and comfort and happiness and a meaningful life are just around the corner, blinding us to the much that we already have, and more importantly, to the grace of God that makes our very existence possible. Now, many of us might know that Martin Luther disliked the letter of James. He called it a right strawy epistle because it only mentions Christ 2 times and, Luther says, has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it. And yet James and Luther seem to be constantly pointing toward the same problem, which is this: you cannot save yourself. Divine favor just doesn't look like that. God's grace doesn't work like that. And maybe I'm digressing a bit here, but I have to wonder if there's any difference between James saying, "But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you?" And is there any difference between that and Luther in the 95 Theses writing, "What is this new piety of God and the Pope that for the sake of money they permit someone who is impious and an enemy to redeem from purgatory a pious God-pleasing soul, and yet do not for the sake of the need of that very pious and beloved soul redeem it purely out of love?" Luther is challenging the idea that God's favor can be bought to get someone out of purgatory, rather than God's love as the basis for such an act. And these are the words that Luther would not recant because he claimed there was gospel in them. And there is. While it might feel like the strongest law binding us up when we have all we need and then some, when we just want to buy something shiny and new. But here's the thing, on all the other days, this is gospel. When your imposter syndrome shows up and your experiment fails and you run headlong into your own selfishness and dinner got burnt in the pan and you got a pink slip and there was more month than money in it, then you see it for the gospel that it is. James said, "Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you?" He's saying that it is blasphemy to be told that you matter only as much as what's in your bank account, or the number of letters that follow your name, or the square footage in your house, or that you own a house at all. Because an excellent name has been invoked over you. You've been claimed and named. Grace is no backup plan, but it is our true value and worth. The real work of faith is the endless challenge to assign value to anyone, no value to anyone, including ourselves, other than that which God gives to each of us. Beloved children of God, and heirs of the riches of God's grace.